Okay, we're continuing with the British imagination, basically the history of Britain, especially its great achievements, and I'm emphasizing in this book review the cultural history of England, of Britain. I will show a few science and technical things like this guy right here, Sir Humphrey Davy. He's a great chemist. He was a mentor to Michael Faraday, one of the greatest scientists to ever live. And I also made the point that the jerks from the 1700s like Voltaire, Diderot, D'Alembert, they all were sort of very anti-religion, anti-Christian, atheistic, and they called themselves the Enlightenment as they are the enlightened ones with reason, and claiming that the Christians are stupid and backward. But in reality, it was the devout Christians who did 99+% of all the scientific achievement. And here's just like a typical thing. This is Humphrey Davy. O most magnificent and noble nature, have I not worshipped thee with such love as never before a mortal man displayed, adored thee in thy majesty of visible creation? So what I'm saying here is when you study science, you realize the complexity and beauty of it is so amazing. It had to come from God. So scientists and people who really study science seriously, they are often very religious. Like Isaac Newton's the classic example, James Clerk Maxwell. And here's another guy who's from the same mode, Thomas Faraday. He said the book of nature, which we read, is written by the hand of God. Okay, he self-educated himself, to become a magnificent scientist. Got a job working in a used bookstore, read lots of books. That's how he got access to books. He was too poor, and he became one of the greatest scientists who ever lived. Okay, now here was a big event in 1851 in England. This was the Great Exhibition at the Crystal Palace, okay, like in Hyde Park in London. So they made this magnificent building, which is kind of like a glorified greenhouse. All these glass walls and windows to let the light in, supported by metal frames. And Prince Albert, the husband of Queen Victoria, was really a major contributor to the whole process. So here is Prince Albert with Queen Victoria. And as far as rulers go, overall, Queen Victoria was one of the better rulers, largely because she was more laissez-faire, didn't mess with things as much. She was Christian, she tried to support religion and other things, so she did some good things. So I can understand why there was a bit of a Victorian Renaissance, if you will, and a lot of high culture in England, and I like that and respect that. Prince Albert was sort of German by his descent, but he was very supportive of England and got along well, and I like the fact that he promoted industry and the Great Exhibition. But the problem I have with the English in the 1800s is they had an attitude of high culture for themselves, freedom and education for themselves, but they did not want that for the people of Ireland or the people of India. They were relatively tolerant of the Scottish after they'd beaten the crap out of them for a long time in the 1700s, but they were terrible to the Irish and to the people of India. So here is, let me show you what happened. Here's how the Irish were treated. The Irish were treated as slaves. And during the potato famine of the 1840s, the British did many things to try to make sure they would finish off and kill the Irish. The population of Ireland decreased by more than 50%. Many millions of them starved to death. And the British were basically slaves or peasant serfs of the English for over 1,000 years. And I'll show you another thing. There's a famous philosopher, John Stuart Mill. And when people think of John Stuart Mill, they think of his books like Utilitarianism and On Liberty, okay? And people say, oh, wasn't he a great proponent of freedom and liberty? You have to remember, the reason why I'm not such a big fan of John Stuart Mill is think about what he actually said. Utilitarianism, and Ayn Rand describes this, it's actually very evil. What utilitarianism says is the greatest good for the greatest number. But they don't explain what that means. It has no respect for individual rights. If 9 out of the 10 declare they want cannibalism and they're going to eat the 10th person, that's the greatest good for the greatest number. So Ayn Rand was correct when she said the only way you really have freedom is if you guarantee individual rights. The smallest minority is individual, the individual one person. You treat them with respect. And then if you ask yourself, well, what is it that respects the individual person? There's nothing that respects the individual person more than Christianity. Christianity says the individual person is created in the image of God. Therefore, although all humans are part beast, they are also part divine. And being part divine, they are intrinsically entitled to natural rights. The right of freedom, of free speech, of privacy, of property, they deserve to be not abused, If you don't have those individual rights, then you shift into what's called atheistic Darwinism. We're going to talk about that in another lecture here on the history of England, where the default scenario is that mankind is just an ape, a monkey that talks, in which case he has no intrinsic value, no intrinsic rights. He's not entitled to anything. And that's the path that atheistic secular leadership goes down. And that's why an atheistic secular ruler wants that, to get rid of religion, because it means that the individual has no rights and they become the equivalent of a god on earth. All of this is so simple, but the average American is a functional, illiterate, educated at a public school who's ahistorical, doesn't know anything. And that's why freedom is just slipping away, because the public has allowed itself to be labeled as literally dumb talking monkeys entitled to nothing. And that's what they're going to get. To be treated like stupid monkeys entitled to nothing. And so it's sad, but that's what's going to happen to everybody. I'm sad about it. There's nothing I can do about it, but I'm going to be sent down that same path. Okay, here's just another painting of the Crystal Palace for the Great Exhibition of 1851, where England showed off its tremendous progress in industry and science, part of the Industrial Revolution and all the machines it made, its increase in productivity. But again, while the Englishman here, you see him in this picture, he's playing yard golf, he's a rich man with living in a big castle, all the food he could want, luxury, leisure, free time. The Irish are starving to death and being killed, and their lands being taken away, evicted from their property. During this time, many millions of Irish migrated to the USA. And in the USA, they were treated like crap too. They were seen as the papists, because most of the Christians in the USA at that time were Protestant. Okay, but I'm just saying this. That's a double standard, all right? So it's a big double standard, okay? And like I said, John Stuart Mill, he didn't want freedom for the people of India. He only wanted it for the Englishmen. Okay, and most of the people in Victorian England, they didn't live that well. Most of them were real poor. There was simply the ruling aristocrats, the elites, that were wealthy and had all these things. The average Victorian English person was poor and lived a relatively difficult life. Here's a nice picture of the indoors of the Great Exhibition in 1851, and it was pretty spectacular. The progress in the 1800s was amazing. It was like the most rapid phase of growth in the history of the world. Progress in the 1900s was really not as rapid as this. Everybody talks about a few big things, but it wasn't like in the 1800s. Okay, we of course had electricity, which is a big deal. What we've had in the last 50 years is mostly progress in computers, not that much in other things. Okay, now here's somebody who did some good things. This was Florence Nightingale, the nurse. She was actually of aristocratic birth, but she felt that she had a vision. She'd been called by God to become a nurse and help people. Her parents are like, why do you want to be a nurse? You're an aristocrat. Being a nurse is low-life, dirty work. Why would you want that? She became famous in the Crimean War between Russia and England. That was in 1854 to 1856. Tolstoy fought on the side of the Russians, and he wrote the big book, War and Peace, about that. She went there and she saw the conditions were terrible. The wounded soldiers, were living in squalor with very cramped conditions, poor vent. She improved ventilation, helped minimize overcrowding, mandated hand washing, tracked outcomes. She really improved outcomes a lot. Okay, and she got a bunch of Catholic nuns that volunteered to help with her. She walked around the lamp, and she became known as the Lady of the Lamp, very much like King Arthur's Lady of the Lake. In 1860, after the Crimean War, she established the first nursing training school. And it was partly because she was an aristocrat that she had more clout to get things done and to get people to do stuff for her, rather than a peasant would not have had that much ability. But she did a lot of good stuff. Oh, here's just a picture of Leo Tolstoy. Now, Leo Tolstoy is a good writer because he has accuracy of perception. When you read a book by Leo Tolstoy, it's like watching a movie camera. He so nicely describes things. You can clearly visualize it as if you were there, and that is a good thing. But he's almost like an artificial intelligence writer in the sense that he has no moral compass. Leo Tolstoy is a scumbag. The more you read about Leo Tolstoy, the more you will hate him. he was a bad person, okay? And I say that having read a lot about him. I took extra courses in Russian literature and was interested in it when I was a college student. And I started out loving Leo Tolstoy for the beauty of his description. But I came away thinking of him the same way that Ayn Rand does. He was an evil scumbag, okay? He totally was terrible to his serfs, to his wife. He was just a jerk. Okay, another very famous thing that came out of the Crimean War was the charge of the Light Brigade. And it was actually a military tactical blunder. It was totally stupid. The officers commanded the soldiers of the cavalry to charge towards these guns up in the hills controlled by the Russians. And they didn't have good reconnaissance, and they were running into a triple crossfire. The Russians were on both sides of the hills and at the far end of the hills. And these poor chumps in the Light Brigade charged straight into a crossfire and frontal fire, and they were decimated, okay? Brutalized, awful. Okay, so yeah, it was brave, but it was stupid, and that was the famous charge of the Light Brigade. And the reason, too, it became so famous is because Lord Tennyson, the great English poet of the 1800s, wrote the poem about it. And you'll read some of it. You'll recognize it immediately. Half a league, half a league, half a league onward, all in the valley of death rode the 600. So the 600 men of the Light Brigade. And then here's sort of like the classics lines. Someone had blundered, but theirs is not to make reply. Theirs is not to reason why. Theirs is but to do or die. So this idea of complete obedience. But, complete obedience to a stupid officer means death. Okay, and that's what happened to most of them. Very few survived. That is the charge of the Light Brigade. A little bit more about Florence Nightingale. Here's Florence Nightingale intake of some wounded soldiers at her hospital there towards the front in the Crimean War. Okay. And here's another nice painting of her. This one is the Lady with the Lamp, and she would make rounds on all the wounded soldiers. So, and of course, like I said, it reminds you of the Lady of the Lake from King Arthur. So what she did was good. She modernized nursing in a very good way and saved a lot of people's lives, so that was good, and she really was a heroic figure. So she deserved to become famous. Oh, one last thing, I was going to talk a little bit about Tolstoy. And some people say, well, how could I say that about Tolstoy? I don't say that based on ignorance. I say that based on reading a couple of biographies of him. The more I learned about it, the more I was disgusted by him. Okay? There's no message in his books other than just, you're screwed. Fate will determine your life, and there's nothing you could do. And that's also why Ayn Rand hated him, because he basically says, you're born into a situation, and there's not much you can do about it, so just accept it. That's Tolstoy. That's Tolstoy's view of life. Anna Karenina is a typical story. She's married to an older guy who she didn't love, and so she had an affair with a younger guy, but society, harshly had a backlash against them, so she committed suicide. Okay, well, what a nice story. And he went and, fought in some hopeless, miserable situation like the charge of the Light Brigade. Okay, so they're basically doomed by fate. Versus, you read a great book like Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky, you see that the young Dostoevsky was like the young Ivan, who sort of destroyed himself with all this pure reason. Pure reason alone won't get you through life. You have to have the emotional component, and if you want a beautiful, happy life, the best way to go is Christianity. To be like Alyosha, to try to be nice to everybody, get along with everybody. Alyosha is the lesson in Brothers Karamazov, that's how you can live a good, happy life, get along with people, and be happy yourself. In Charles Dickens, in Christmas Carol, you see the message. Attitude of gratitude makes everybody better off and happier. Okay, in Quo Vadis, you see the contrast between the Christians and this is a book by Henry Sienkiewicz, the Polish novelist, the tremendous difference between the Christians and the Romans. And it's like Pascal's poem says, it shows you that's the best way to live, for your sake and for everybody else. That's why I like Catholic Christianity so much better than Protestant Christianity, because Catholic Christianity emphasizes let's have a good life here on earth by being nice, being good, and helping each other, versus Protestant tends to emphasize do what we say, the preacher, or you'll burn in hell, the afterlife, which who the heck knows what happens in the afterlife, okay? There's a lot of debate. Believe me, I read tons of Bible commentary, religious commentary on theories of the afterlife. It's not that well understood, okay? Les Mis, same thing, live like Christ, like the bishop, and you make the world better for everyone else. Like he forgave Jean Valjean, and Jean Valjean became this great man, did all these good things. The importance of being earnest. How much better everyone's life is if you have a sense of humor. Same thing out of Alice in Wonderland, Tristram Shandy, for example. Okay, anyways, I think that's it for today. I hope you found that helpful, and we got lots more coming on the history of Britain.